5 still work? And so let me just put this to you quite bluntly. Were, say, Russia to attack a member of NATO, and that country then invokes Article 5, would the United States definitely come to that country's defense?
Well, let me be clear from the perspective of the Department of War. The United States is committed to NATO. It's committed to Article 5. You know, the President on down have all made that clear. I think the main message is, you know, that frame that you're asking, that we often hear from our European friends, is almost like a theological frame that's asking sort of about the purity of heart, if you will. And I think what we've seen over the last year, and it was very important in the administration in 2025, starting with Vice President Vance, the President, et cetera, Secretary Hegseth, in his engagements and so forth, to kind of reframe NATO. You know, the way we think about it is, you know, you had a NATO 2.0, which was kind of a post-Cold War NATO, you know, very focused on these abstractions that Secretary Rubio talked about very eloquently this morning, the liberal rules-based order, and it became very dependent on the United States. And some of that, to be honest, was the fault of the political establishment in the United States. So we're not putting the fault at all on our allies, but it's shared. But what we're looking for and what we're pushing now is a NATO 3.0. And the good news is that I think, as Secretary General Rutte has eloquently said, thanks to President Trump, NATO is actually stronger than ever and is put on the trajectory for long-term sustainable, durability and strength and efficacy. And that involves a couple of things. It involves the kind of flexible realism, sort of brass tacks, practical, results-oriented mindset, a refocusing on, in a sense, going back to what you can think of as NATO 1.0, of NATO as a military alliance. And when you think of it that way, and I think it's very compatible with the zeitgeist, if you will, of the Chancellor's speech yesterday, which is, let's get down to business. Let's understand. If you go back to the 1950s, a friend of mine just sent me a quote from Konrad Adenauer from 1955-56 about you can't rely too much on the Americans over time. It's not reasonable. Let's get down to business. So I think that the main thing that we want to do looking forward with this NATO 3.0 approach is to say, all right, let's come to a much more equitable and thus sustainable model that's focused on an effective, rational defense of NATO, with Europe taking primary responsibility for its conventional defense, backed up by meeting those spending pledges, led by President Trump with Secretary General Rutte and the European leaders, that will enable that. And if you look over time, that is a really promising sort of vista where we're going to have, you know, a Europe that is strong, that is populous, that is wealthy, that is able to field really serious military force. And I see friends of ours from the Indo-Pacific, and we're asking the same thing. I was in South Korea, the first non-NATO ally to commit to 3.5%, the new global standard, as the national security strategy has said. I think that's where, you know, we see not a retreat of the United States from its alliances, but a kind of moderate approach that puts it on a much more sustainable path.
So, Bridge, that was a great answer, but it was a yes/no question. And the issue I have with that, and so even if everyone buys that this is where NATO 3.0 is headed and what it needs to be, the reason why the question is, at least as you called it, theological, is because it could be real. I mean, so for example, take the town of Narva in Estonia, Russian-speaking. Russia could attack and say, you know what, we take this territory. Estonia then could invoke Article 5, which everyone knows the only country that has ever done that is the United States. I mean, you can't give a NATO 3.0 answer to that. It kind of has to be a yes or no.
I think the NATO 3.0 answer is the answer to that, because the President points out, we're not going to, I'm a government official. When I was in the think tank, I might have given you a different answer. I'm a government official, and we don't engage in speculation. What the United States is doing and backs up, and the President has shown in places like Venezuela and in Operation Midnight Hammer, is he is prepared to use military force decisively to back up his pledges, to work with our allies, like our model ally, Israel. And we train, we ready our forces, we think intimately, I think intimately, and we have discussions about just these practicalities that show, and this is the spirit, certainly we at the Department of War, but I would say throughout our administration, is we are more in the delivering results and readiness business than in the cheap talk business. And that distinguishes us from our predecessors. I will say that directly, because you challenged me on this point. President Trump and his administration, under his historic leadership, we are doing more, and we are going to be ready, but we're putting things on a more sustainable basis, and I think that's the best answer I can give. And that's an answer that Europeans should actually, that's a credible, honest, candid, realistic answer. You can have all the shibboleths, the recitation of the shibboleths, you can have all the promises, but if you can't practically and realistically back it up and make it worthwhile to the American people, that's an empty promise.
Sure. I mean, look, the Europeans, when they've heard this and what they've responded to me in the past is that, and I don't defend the Biden administration here, but words do matter, signals matter. And as far as that goes, there is a sense of fear in Europe that the clause doesn't matter as much anymore. Let me shift now from.
Can I just say one thing on that? I think words do matter. I think what we're saying is we are going to make sure that we and our allies are making commitments and we're following through on it. We're about delivering results. And so, I think the last administration was a lot of overpromising and under-delivering. We're sort of in the opposite, camp, or not opposite, but like being clear, strong and clear, but quiet, and kind of not looking to sort of peacock, if you will, but really focusing on building up strength. I mean, President Trump has committed to pursuing a $1.5 trillion budget. We have a historic attempt to overhaul our sort of laggardly and in some cases moribund defense industrial base to get it fit for purpose. National mobilization of our defense industrial base. That's what our allies should actually want. That's results.
Sure, fair enough. I mean, again, Mark Rutte, when he was asked this question at Davos, said very clearly, Mr. President, we will come to your defense. But let me move on from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, because you've been arguing for a while, and now the administration does as well, that by sort of shifting burden sharing in this relationship in NATO, that allows the United States to have more of a focus on Asia. Talk to us a little bit about what that has meant in the last 14-odd months of this administration.
Well, sure. I mean, I think what we say in both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, we're going back to, kind of a common sense, pragmatic focus on Americans' interests and sort of mapping our overall strategy onto, where our interests are most impinged upon and most threatened and where our contributions make the most difference, but also critically where we think our allies' interests lie realistically, and also where they can make the most material and relevant contributions. So this is a very different model from the last administration's one theater approach, which was kind of a non-military, sort of non-realistic, much more sort of normative, rules-based international order approach. Ours is saying we're going to go meet our allies where they are. We hear people here talking about, obviously, a lot about Russia. I was in Korea. They're talking a lot about North Korea. You go other places, they're talking about, other countries, et cetera. We're saying, okay, we're going to work with the warp and woof. We're going to work with the current of those interests, and that's where countries will be willing to sort of put up. And then we'll take where our contribution is going to make the greatest difference and where our interests are most engaged, relatively speaking, and that's where we're going to focus. Doesn't mean we're going to do nothing in those other areas, but if you look at our strategy, it says Homeland and Hemisphere. We need to refocus. The military is a critical part of that. Obviously, a lot of that stuff is not in the military domain, but it is a critical part of that. Secondly, the first island chain and stability there, deterring China through strength, not confrontation. I think we have a very similar approach to our allies and partners there. And then in other theaters, obviously here, looking at Europe and NATO vis-a-vis Russia, looking to our wealthy allies, and I think the Chancellor made this point eloquently yesterday, saying, Germany alone is a larger economy than Russia. This is a viable, tractable problem. Similarly, I was in South Korea last month. They're saying, North Korea is our primary threat. Okay. And they're willing to take the lead for conventional defense on the peninsula as well. That's what we're seeing. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing, obviously, I can't talk about in detail, but I think a lot of what we're saying is we're going to get the force back to a kind of a focus on lethality and readiness. Secretary Hegseth has made a kind of historic approach to get back to the basics there. And then on the industrial side, I mean, ultimately we see this tragically in the war in Ukraine. These modern conflicts are going to be wars of production, so we need to have a defense industry that can produce for ourselves and for our allies, and I would say we're also very supportive of our allies growing their defense industrial base, and that'll put us on a long-term trajectory, and we're confident that this will be the recipe for stability, but also deterrence and defense.
Let me talk about China now. There's a sense that between, say, 2016, the start of the first Trump administration, and, say, 24, there was a real ascendance of China hawks in D.C. writ large, but in the White House and in two administrations. there's a sense now that that trend has reversed a little bit, and I'll just cite a couple of things that suggest so. One is really pulling back from some of the tariff policies from early last year after China imposed export controls on rare earths and critical minerals. There's also the United States pulling back on chip restrictions for the highest end chips. And there's a growing sense when you add all of this up together that the United States has actually changed its posture on China. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm not sure I could characterize how the overall trajectory. I would say that I think the United States wants a stable and respectful relationship with China. Obviously, we want to avoid conflict. We also want to be able to engage in mutually beneficial commerce, but we obviously recognize from the president on down that we need to do that from a position of strength. Obviously, that's commercial and economic strength. On the military side, I think we're very clear about that. That's strong and clear but quiet, that focus on the first island chain. And we need to work with our allies, particularly our allies in the Indo-Pacific, to build up a position of collective strength. I think we've been actually quite clear. I don't know how this relates. I wouldn't presume to sort of characterize it, but it's a coherent approach that's very akin to this common sense America First approach. We're not, under the president's kind of visionary leadership.
Can you define America First, just so we have like a dictionary
sure.
definition?
I would say America First, and I think a little bit of the hack for America First is the common sense approach. I think common sense, the president talks about common sense.
But my common sense is different from your common sense.
Okay, so, it's not a scientific theorem, but it's basically saying, are things working out for regular Americans, right? And I think that obviously people are going to contest what that means, and that's actually good.
It also sounds like foreign policy for the middle class.
Well, I think people are contesting. Our conceit is that we're doing a lot better job, right? And part of that is, and of course that's the president's contribution on taking and saying, like on the international trade regime, and saying, wait a minute, this is not working for Americans, and saying the sort of orthodoxy of the economist class is not actually working. Okay, we're going to relook at that. NATO, like you come to a place like the Munich Security Conference, and I say this with respect, but for many, many years, it was the same kind of the recitations, right? And the president saying, wait a minute, how does it make sense for very wealthy, prosperous, developed countries to be spending close to 1% and we're spending 4 to 5% of GDP and we're using our forces? Again, a lot of the blame goes on Americans for those decisions, but that's sort of a common sense reassessment. I think with China, I think we understand and we respect China's tremendous achievements over many years in the development of its economy, its significant, very significant military buildup, and we're acting accordingly, but we treat it respectfully and looking at it in a clear-eyed way with the goal of a favorable balance of power and stability. And those are some of the themes that I tried to lay out in my speech at the Sejong Institute in Seoul, which is to say, and I think actually in our engagements with the Chinese, honestly, I think it resonates in the sense that obviously both sides are looking for advantage and negotiating, and that's a very direct matter. But it's not a kind of, as we've said, we're not trying to strangle China, which obviously you hear, you probably have heard this over the years, that the Chinese belief that we were trying to strangle their growth or hold them down. That's not what we're trying to do, but we're going to make sure that we and our allies and partners are operating from a position of strength. That, to me, is common sense. Obviously, we're not communists in the Trump administration, to say the least, but it's also not our job to say what the government of China is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I will say, though, that this morning, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, when he was speaking, he did say that, for example, the UN works just fine, which was a direct refutation of what Secretary of State Marco Rubio said. And then he did point a finger at, quote unquote, certain countries. So, in as much as there's a change in policy, I'm not sure I'm seeing a great change in tone.
Well, but tone is, we're not naive. Like this is a tough, clear-eyed, relationship. Obviously, fortunately, our presidents have an excellent relationship. But, this is a relationship of of two very significant players, and we're going to agglomerate, our strength and position. Again, we're going to be engaging, we're going to be direct, we're going to be realistic, we're going to be respectful, but we're also going to look after the American people and also our allies and partners.
You were very influential in the writing of the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy. The word Taiwan doesn't show up in either of those. Is there a reason why? And lead us into a little bit of a discussion about how you're thinking about deterrence for Taiwan.
Well, I think I have nothing to say in terms of any policy change or position or emphasis even on the issue of Taiwan. I think our president is actually quite consistent with our traditional position of the, our one China policy and other things, 6 assurances, et cetera. So I think, the goal is obviously these public documents, we understand that people look at them very carefully. We measure our words carefully, as I said earlier. And we, obviously the president is our spokesman on matters, especially on matters, well, on anything, but certainly on matters of great sensitivity. We have hewed closely to our position, and we're focused obviously on our position in the Western Pacific. But we're seeking stability. We're seeking, but stability involves both a willingness to engage, but also clarity and strength. And we're all about building up a position of strength. And if you look at the budget, if you look at what we're doing with our defense industry, if you look at what we're enlisting our allies, well, I wouldn't even say enlisting, encouraging our allies to do for their own reasons, that's the right mix under President Trump's leadership.
So I take your point quite well about common sense, and I think there's an element about common sense that really appeals to people and even to policymakers. And even to journalists. There's an element of cognitive dissonance for me sometimes when I look at utterances from the White House and documentation and then conversations like this. So one of them, of course, at the start of the year was Greenland. It genuinely befuddled many of us trying to understand, why the United States would threaten either war or coercive economic tactics to take territory from a NATO ally. The second one, and this is more related to what we were just talking about, was the idea of a Donroe doctrine, this idea that there are spheres of influence. And so in that kind of thinking, the United States focuses more on its hemisphere. And here's my question now. What happens to the other hemisphere? Because the implication then is that China and Russia should have their way.
Well, let me actually directly answer this last point, because I hear it come up and I hear government counterparts talk about it. I see zero evidence from the United States government in any sort of authoritative statement or quarter that we are conceding, hemispheric spheres of influence to anybody else. To the contrary, the authoritative statements of the U.S. government, whether the national security strategy or the national defense strategy, literally say the contrary. Now we're working with our allies to ensure that that's a sustainable mix. But I see that as a projection, and a little bit it's sort of this normative frame that people say, oh, well, maybe they're thinking that way in my estimation, so maybe they have to give it to the others. I don't think that logic is how, certainly I think, but I don't think how people in the administration think. I think we're looking for a favorable balance of power with our allies and partners in a kind of hard-nosed, credible way. At the same time, we are also engaging, we obviously have negotiations with Moscow designed to obviously try to end the tragic war in Ukraine. We're engaging with China on a variety of fronts, trade and otherwise, et cetera, in military channels. The president's team is negotiating with Iran, et cetera. So, I think this is actually a common sense miss that if we went back and had this conference in 1980, this would seem like pretty obvious. Both Ronald Reagan and his predecessors did this kind of thing. And, I mentioned the Harmel report in my speech at the Defense Ministerial, which is it's been the established dual track in NATO during the Cold War, which is, of course, you want to be strong, but you also got to see if you can narrow and potentially try to avoid a conflict if it comes because of misperception and miscalculation.
Yeah, I like that you use the word normative there in terms of like the critiques. They are normative in large part because some norms are being challenged, and I think that's where that critique comes from.
I think that's true, and I think Secretary Rubio owned that, and I said the same. I think I said the other day that I was very encouraged. I only heard the rules-based international order mentioned once while I was in Brussels, and that was a real progress.
Why don't you like the term?
Well, I think it's both a misconception. Whether it exists or not, but it actually gets people, especially in this kind of context, and misleads them in terms of the frame in which they approach the alliances. So it becomes more about a sort of catechism and how much you hew to this purported catechism rather than a practical discussion, almost like a business-like discussion about, all right, how do we make sure that this operation is sustainable over the long term, that everybody's pulling their weight? Somebody, a good friend of mine who's involved, he said, one of the things people are trying to do, you see Secretary Besson making the point about 22 trillion. And again, I don't want to harangue the point too much, but there's sort of a mark-to-market element here, which is like, hey, wait a minute, this has been way out of whack. Let's get down to basics. And I think what I'm very encouraged to see, and obviously I disagree with a number of things the Chancellor said yesterday, and I say that with respect. Obviously, we as Americans have a different view, or we in the administration. But overall, the frame was, I would say from him, was very much leaning in and saying, let's get down to business. Let's be practical. We're going to have differences. We had differences during
I will just say, though, that when Chancellor Merz said the international order doesn't work anymore, it isn't here, I think he meant that as a criticism, and the point was...
Well, he's free to say that, but he's not indexing on that and kind of languishing there. He's saying, what I heard the message to people was to say, let's get off that. We may decry it, and actually the minister-president of Bavaria said something similar. Let's move on. Let's get practical. And honestly, and the German government, and not just from the Chancellor, but from Minister Pistorius, who's had a historic role in raising German defense spending and changing the Constitution. They both deserve enormous credit, and their parties, and many others with them. That's the greatest evidence. And if we want to talk about the different, and I do think there are people in this orbit who are still indexed on that, and I think they're going to be left behind, and they're not helping Americans, but more importantly, they're not helping Europeans.
Yeah, I take all of those points. I guess, again, just one last thing on that. The rules matter because, for example, if territorial integrity in Europe doesn't matter, then China could use that as a rationale for Taiwan later. But one last question for you, Bridge, before I let you go. As this sort of very historic burden-sharing change takes place, and as you and others have gotten Europe to carry more of the burden when it comes to defense spending, what does that do over time, 5 years, 10 years from now, to the nuclear umbrella question?
Well, thanks. And I mean, I really got to stress that President on the kind of war fighting, I say it more in the military context, to be ready, obviously, for deterrence and peace. So I think we've got a great recipe. I don't think anybody should miscalculate either the resolve of our president, but also the capability of what the joint force and our allies can do.
All right, Bridge Colby, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Real pleasure. I'm going to keep you all here because we've got another great session that will start in just a minute or two. And I'm going to step to the side because we're going to put another 3 chairs on the stage. And then we'll welcome on our next group of speakers, including Bridge, who's going to stay on with us. So bear with us for a minute. Feel free to check your phones, but stay where you are. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you all to take your seats, please. We're getting ready to start our second addendum session now. Ladies and gentlemen, please do take your seats. Thank you. Please do take your seats, all of you. Okay, we're going to get started now with our second session added on to our first. I'm going to introduce our 5 guests now, and I'm going to ask you to give them a round of applause after I've called them all on stage. And they are Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, also the Minister for Defence; Judith Collins, the Minister of Defence from New Zealand; Toshimitsu Motegi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Japan; David Van Wiel, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the Netherlands, also a former Assistant Secretary General in NATO; and then last but definitely not least, Elbridge Colby, the US Undersecretary for Policy at the Department of War. I'm also going to ask all of you to keep your translation devices on hand because we will need them on our first question. So our session title here is Double Trouble: Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and Connected Security Challenges. So I'm going to start off with Minister Motegi, who will be speaking to us in Japanese. Minister, I'm wondering if you can give us a sense, just to kick us off, of how Japan sees the world right now. How do you see Europe and the Indo-Pacific connected as security theaters?
Thank you. With regard to the Indo-Pacific and European security, I'd like to point out three things. First, we are witnessing the turbulence in the international order. The world is undergoing the most profound structural transformation in post-war history, driven by shifts in the balance of power and the intensification of conflicts and confrontation. Russia's aggression into Ukraine is in denial of the very foundations of the international order, and the transformation of that order is now accelerating at a rapid pace. Meanwhile, in the Indo-Pacific region as well, we are witnessing various confrontations and moves that challenge the existing order. Against this backdrop, under the banner of a free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP, Japan has consistently worked to uphold and strengthen a free and open international order based on the rule of law. Now, in the morning session, the participant from China talked about the security policy of Japan, and this was not based on facts. I will not rebut each statement that was made, but Japan consistently after World War II has tread the path of a peace-loving nation. Going forward, Japan will contribute to the stability and peace of the international society, and Japan's posture to this effect is well known in the international community. Second, the security of the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific is inextricably linked with a strong sense of urgency that today's Ukraine would be tomorrow's East Asia. Japan has coordinated, or Japan would like to coordinate with European countries. East Asia too faces attempts to unilaterally change the status quo by force or coercion in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. We need to also pay attention to the growing linkage of military capabilities and threat that transcend regions. Military cooperation between Russia and North Korea is advancing, and we are deeply concerned by reports that in return for North Korea's cooperation with Russia in Ukraine, Russia is providing financial support and military technology to North Korea. Last year, at the military parade held in Beijing, I'm sure you recall this very well, President Putin and Chairman Kim Jong-un flanked President Xi Jinping on both sides. Japan takes seriously the advancement of cooperation among China, Russia, and North Korea and its impact on regional security, and will continue to monitor the situation closely. Thirdly, the last point, I'd like to talk about cooperation with the United States. The Japan-U.S. alliance remains the cornerstone of Japan's security, and it continues to be vital that the United States remain positively engaged in the Indo-Pacific and the broader international community. To that end as well, the alliance is very important, but it is essential that Japan demonstrate the determination to assume primary responsibility for checking and repelling any aggression against itself and possess the necessary capabilities to do so. Japan has steadily advanced the fundamental strengthening of its defense capabilities. On that basis, we're promoting broad-based security cooperation with the United States, our only treaty ally, and advancing discussions to further enhance the deterrence and response capabilities of the Japan-U.S. alliance. Following last week's general election in Japan, which resulted in a victory for our alliance and coalition, we have the public support to pursue robust foreign and security policies.
日本は日米同盟に加えて、欧州を含みます同志国との重層的な連携というものを重視をいたしております。日本の具体的な協力例について2点申し上げたいと思います。第一に安全保障分野での協力であります。日本は英国、イタリアと。
I think we just lost translation there, Minister. back to you later as we figure out how to get the translation back online. Minister Van Wiel, if I can bring you in. One of the things Minister Motegi was talking about was, in a sense, a connection between Europe and East Asia, in part linking the conflicts in Ukraine and potential conflict in East Asia. Talk to us a little bit about how you see that connection in your mind, and if there are any discrepancies there from what you heard earlier when we were having our conversation.
No, let me be clear. We don't see a military role as we have in NATO in the defense of the Indo-Pacific region. But security is much broader than Article 5-like scenarios that we have to deal with. If you look at cyberspace, if you look at hybrid threats, then we are all in the same arena and we're all facing the same enemies there. If you look at the economic arena, our dependencies and our need to diversify, or the export control measures that we're being hit with, those are all the same, whether you're in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific, so we're connected there. And then thirdly, as was rightly mentioned, there is a connection between the war that's ongoing in Ukraine, the war of aggression of Russia, that is actively being stimulated by China and by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So also in that sense, our security is very much intertwined. We live in one world. We need friends in this very turbulent world, and I think that we are all like-minded nations as we sit here that are willing to cooperate in any which way.
Deputy Prime Minister Miles, let me bring you in. In our previous discussion, we were talking a fair bit about rules and how, you know, in a sense, that hasn't come up that much in this conference so far. Do rules matter?
Look, I think, rules do matter. I think there ends up being something of a conversation where there is, at one level, a dichotomy set up between rules and power, and it's one or the other, whereas, in fact, I think, in truth, those two things have coexisted. I mean, the rules-based order, as we describe it, which has been built up since the Second World War, has been founded on a power contest and at times a power collaboration, but very much at times a power contest, which, to be honest, has been fundamentally borne by the United States. And so the two things are inextricably linked. And I do think that we are living in a world today where power is much more at the centre of global relations than it has been previously. But there's one example that I give to people. If you take a plane, which I've done, and you fly above the territory or the waters between Australia and Indonesia, the Arafura Sea, you can literally see the maritime boundary between Australia and Indonesia, because along it you will see a whole lot of fishing vessels from Indonesia coming to the limits of where they can fish. They are operating by the rules, and we're not talking about international lawyers here. We're talking about people who come from remote fishing villages all along the southern part of Java. They are living by a set of rules, as are we, and actually those rules do give agency to middle powers. It is not a situation, and I really accept what Bridges said, to see rules just as a kind of a catechism and existing on their own terms, unconnected with power, is to get that wrong. The power equation is fundamentally important here, and it needs to be worked on and resourced, and we totally understand the conversation of burden sharing that America is going through with its partners, and to build stronger allies, and we want to be a better ally to the United States is a great outcome for all of us. The practical language which Bridge speaks to, I don't have it. I mean, that is true too, but we should not easily cede the idea of what rules can do. And to be fair, I kind of hear it in what you've said, Bridge. What Secretary Rubio said today was that there is an order which we should not be removing, repairing, but not removing. And I think it is well to remember that.
I'll let Bridge come in on that in a bit, but just before I do that, one more question, Deputy Prime Minister. From your vantage point, when you look at US-China competition, what do you think has changed in the last 14 months with the Trump administration in power?
I think there's a couple of things I would say. Actually, the Trump administration, I think, has been very clear in its articulation of the importance of the Indo-Pacific, and as a country living within the Indo-Pacific, we welcome that. And before the national security strategy came out and national defence strategy, the rhetoric from the Trump administration was as clear about that as we have heard from any American administration, and which is something I've said repeatedly, and we welcome that. It now has, in a sense, form in the national the national security strategy in the NDS, and we very much welcome that as well. So the emphasis on that, I think, is important. But the other point I'd really make is, you know, the single big factor which defines, I think, the strategic complexity of the world as Australia faces it, is the biggest conventional military build-up that we've seen in the world since the end of the Second World War being undertaken by China, but being done so without strategic reassurance, in as much as there really isn't an explanation to those of us else in the world as to what this is for, what is its purpose. That is what has made the world most complicated, and obviously that predates the last 14 months. That's really a process that's been going on for the last 2 decades. That is what is challenging, and that is what's changing the circumstances that we face. And you know, I guess from an Australian point of view, we are very much about working with the United States and other partners like Japan to try and put forward deterrence within the Indo-Pacific so that we can maintain peace and stability and prosperity, a free and open Indo-Pacific. You know, we've continued to do that over the last 14 months, and we're very comfortable with the way in which that's played out.
Minister Collins, let me bring you in. New Zealand is a small but proud and mighty country, and it strikes me that both at Munich here and at Davos before this, there's been a lot of talk about middle powers. There's been a lot of talk about a rupture in the world order, to use Mark Carney's phrase from Canada. We've been talking about Chancellor Merz here, saying that the international order is over. I'm curious about your perspective on this. What happens to smaller countries in a world that is a bit more transactional, a bit more defined by power, as we just heard? How do smaller countries navigate a world less focused on rules, more focused on power?
Well, there's a thing with rules. They actually only work if people want to follow them, and if there is somebody prepared to do something about it when they don't. Otherwise you end up with anarchy. So when I look at this, it is like the best thing for us to do is to do more for ourselves and to do more with our friends and ally. And that's very important. So with Australia, we talk quite a lot about an ANZAC attitude, which is from World War I, Australia, New Zealand Army Corps, but basically the whole lot of the services working much closer together, working with our Five Eyes partners, the US, Canada, UK, as well as Australia, but also working with Five Powers partners such as Singapore and Malaysia, working with countries like South Korea, Republic of Korea, and Japan more now, and also the Philippines. We're also working a little bit more with India. We're going to expand that as we go. So from our point of view, it is understanding we need to do more ourselves. At the same time, we need to work and be interoperable as much as possible with other countries of like-minded countries. I actually think the world is a very dangerous place at the moment, and partly it's because people are not quite focused on, you know, I think like when I come to Europe, strangely enough, is very focused on Europe. Actually, pretty much only focused on Europe and your relationship with the US. I mean, apart from the fact I would say to you, get over it, everyone else has to look after themselves, and we all have to understand that we can't just keep thinking we can go on as we have without significant improvements. And I've seen this also even since last year here, the way in which other countries, such as, say, Germany, have really stepped up. The Netherlands have stepped up. Countries are stepping up because most countries are getting it. The Baltic nations, they know what it's like to be occupied for generations. They don't want to see that again. You've got Russia, Well, let me tell you, Russia is an Indo-Pacific nation. Vladivostok is not on the Atlantic. It's on the Pacific. You've got North Korea sitting there like a nasty big barnacle, ready to move through South Korea if they get the chance. And then you've also got China. So we've got enormous opportunities in the Indo-Pacific for things to go wrong. So we look to you to see how you're handling things, but I'd say to you, think about us too, by the way, because what happens to us is going to affect you, just as what happens to you affects us.
I'm going to take some audience questions in about a minute. I'm just going to ask Bridge one last question. First of all, if there's anything you'd like to respond to here, but also I'm curious how, as we know that China and Russia and North Korea and sometimes Iran as well are all cooperating and colluding in these various arenas of conflict that we've been discussing. Do you tend to see them as a bloc, or would you rather have individual strategies to deal with them?
Well, thanks. Well, first of all, I'd just say I think what we've heard very eloquently from all of the ministers is really, I think, further evidence of this momentum. I think everybody's kind of saying we need to do our part, and are doing it. And I won't comment individually except to say I think that's just we're all seeing the right movement, and now it's more of a conversation about how do we work together to go full steam ahead together. Obviously, and this connects to your actual question, Ravi. This is actually an interesting question that I would say is something we think about quite a bit. The way I would put it is from a military planning point of view. It's not always worst case, but you got to plan for the bad case. And in that context, you need to be prepared for things to happen concurrently, because they could, even if potential opponents don't actively collude, they might act opportunistically because the right time to move may be when we are tied down or more engaged in one theater or two theaters or what have you. So that is the right planning assumption for the military, and that's one of the reasons why there's so much urgency, is because we need our partners to all act with that mindset. And I think, as Minister Collins was just saying, everybody's kind of got to look, and this is where I think the global perspective is exactly right. So we do need to see things interconnected I just think in the right ways that are more practical, like in a sense that it's, and not to bang on about this, but it is not one theater. Things are going to be in one place at one time. That doesn't mean we're completely discombobulated or incapable. To the contrary, but it means we're planning, we're saying, let's all be in a place where we've got a good buffer of assurance. And I think that's, because we're all ready. And of course, the Americans are going to be everywhere, but we're going to be doing it in a way that's linked to practical military planning. And then the other side, or whatever, those other powers are all going to see that, and they're going to say, yeah, today's not the day. I'm better off going with that stability model that we're all talking about, where it's better to keep jaw-jawing rather than war-warring, even if there's a crisis or conflict in one or more theaters. I think at the same time, and under this is the president's leadership on our side, on the kind of War Department side, under Secretary Hegseth's leadership. At the same time, so much of our diplomacy is designed precisely to avoid. This is something I'd like to point out. And again, I think this is a substantive point. At the end of the last administration, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was openly talking about how he used the term, our adversaries were aligned to an unprecedented degree. Now, it used to be a basic of American foreign policy that you don't want all of your opponents to be aligned against you, right? So that, to me, that's a fundamental admission of the failure of that policy. And I think it was a result of a combination of more talk and less of the action department. And I think you see, in a sense, if not the total reverse, a much different approach in our administration under the president's leadership, which is to be strong.
But those adversaries are still aligned.
Well, no, they're not. We watch this very closely, and our diplomacy is designed in part to not to necessarily. We don't have any delusions about how much there is cooperation, there is collaboration, but it is also transactional, to use your term. It is strategic. It is partial, and there are incentives for them to be. And trust me, we watch this very closely. They are not fully aligned. And it is part of our job to induce them or pressure them in many cases not to align together. That is actually what we don't want, because that is the worst case. And we should use all of our instruments of power, military on the one end, diplomatic on the other, along with our allies and partners, and sensitive, of course, to their particular views on these topics, but precisely to avoid that that degree of collusion or that degree of alignment, which is actually the worst outcome.
So which of those four might be most susceptible to the kind of pressure you're describing to not form an alliance with the other three?
I mean, I think we're talking, I mean, I think more or less, I mean, I don't know exactly, you know, obviously there's been some discussion in North Korea, but I think we're actually in negotiations with Beijing, Moscow in some way or another, and Tehran. And we're conscious of that, you know, and we're looking at that connectivity, but we're not looking at it as if it's like a given that they're all hardened together. We're looking at it partially with coercive lenses. I mean, you see what we're doing on things like the shadow fleet, you see what the actions we're taking in the Western Hemisphere, et cetera, using various instruments of national power. But we're also using inducements to try to say, hey, it's in your interest not to go, you know, axis of evil, if you will.
All right. I'm going to take some audience questions. I see lots of hands. Let me go first to Lynn Kwok in row 2. If we can have a microphone over to her. So your name, affiliation, and a question, not a comment, please.
Thank you so much, Ravi. This was an excellent panel, as was your session with the Undersecretary earlier. My question is directed to the Deputy Prime Minister as well as the Prime Minister of Japan. Thank you very much for your comments. I'd appreciate your views on something in the National Defense Strategy. So the National Defense Strategy actually stipulated or said that the United States would make clear to its European allies that Europe should focus its attention and resources on, you know, its own neighborhood, was best focused there. Could I have your views on the division of labor, the best division of labor between the two spheres, and how important is European presence to the Indo-Pacific in your views? Yesterday, I spoke to the Japanese defense minister who talked about the presence of vessels from Europe in the region, and I would like to know whether or not this is important to the region, not least to signal that that international law matters, that the rule matters, and some of the contestation taking place is not simply a US-China contest, but it matters to the international community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. And that was a question to Deputy Prime Minister Marles and the Foreign Minister from Japan. Okay, just quick answers, please.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there is a fundamental division of labour. I mean, far and away, the bulk of what we do, I mean, the vast bulk of what we do is in the Indo-Pacific, and the vast bulk of what European countries do is in Europe. You know, and I think sticking to your knitting is an important idea, and certainly coming out of our Defence Strategic Review, having a very focused defence policy for us is really important. That said, I think having a level of connectedness makes sense. You know, there's been a lot of commentary about how our theatres are interconnected. I would very much agree with that. And it's kind of in the question that you asked. I think it is an important signal to have some presence. It's not a lot, but it's important from European countries in Indo-Pacific. And equally, you know, it is unimaginable, with Russia and China signing a no-limits agreement on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is unimaginable that the lessons from Ukraine will not be learnt in the Indo-Pacific. So that conflict is relevant to Australia's national interest. And as a result, we do provide support. It's not the it's a small part of what we do, but it's an important part of what we do, and I think that's probably how I'd express it.
Minister Motegi, if we can get a short answer from you as well, please.
Is the translation okay?
Yes, earlier I was talking about the changes in strategic environment in Europe and the Pacific. There are 3 points. I mentioned that the international order is going through great big changes. And number 2, Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific relationship are inseparable, and Japan-US alliance is extremely important, but we must have a willingness of protecting our own countries by ourselves and have that capability. That is extremely important. That will also serve in strengthening the alliance. That's was mentioned, not only about alliance, but Japan and European countries. Among the like-minded countries, cooperation is also necessary. For example, now Japan, with the UK and Italy, we are developing the next generation fighter jointly. And British asset paid a visit to Japan, and Japan's F-15 visits Europe. So in many ways, we have military exchanges going on. And I believe that Russia, China, North Korea, the authoritarian countries are different. So cooperation among these countries, we must try to stop their cooperation as much as possible. On the other hand, on our side, critical minerals, for example, we must have our own supply chain. We must think of how we can establish a supply chain among ourselves. And for free and open trade, with Japan and the EU, we have EPA, which we must also advance. When I was a minister, we signed the CPTPP, and UK also joined the CPTPP. So in the area of economy, cooperation partnership is also important in enhancing our relationship.
Thank you, Minister Motegi. Let me take on a couple more questions together. I'll do one right in row one over here. The lady, if we can weave a microphone over to her, and then one more, the gentleman in row three.
Thank
Go ahead.
you so much. Thank you. My name is Hannah Laha. I'm a member of the parliament from Estonia. When we talk about security risks, of course, we all have our own different foreign relations, and we can talk about defense and so on, but one security threat that is a threat to all countries in the world is climate change, and it's especially affecting the Indo-Pacific area. So my question, I guess, is to anyone who has a good answer, and that is how and if can we bring the talk of ambitious climate policy back to the world and as leaders. Thank you.
Okay, let's put a pin in that, and we'll take one more question from the gentleman in row three.
Thank you very much for taking my questions. My name is Sho Kawakita from Kyoto News, Japan. My question goes to Dr. Colby, Undersecretary Colby, about the NSS and the NDS. Both documents have stipulated that first island chain has a sort of a defensive line, and both documents emphasize the importance of deterring China at that line. But as we know, Chinese military is operating already beyond the line. And are you sure and are you optimistic that the deterrence will not fail even in 10 years or 15 years, 20 years? Because I understand the ball is the hand of a Chinese supreme leader in Beijing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Would anyone like to take on the climate change question?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that we who live in the, have to deal with cyclones and everything else in the South Pacific, that we have to adapt to what there is. I mean, what New Zealand does is important, but it is not going to deal with the fact that we have major climate change issues. What we need to do is adapt. It's one of the things that our Defence Force deals with, which is dealing with the defence of our country against major weather events. So look, I think, you know, climate policy is one thing. Actually, actions speak louder than words. And frankly, I'd rather our Defence Force got more money so they can come out and do more and protect people at times of trouble. So look, I don't think New Zealand's climate policy is going to affect the entire world. Sorry to say that, because I'm sure it would be excellent if it was. But it is an important issue, and of course it's being used by some to create all sorts of division, and as well as that uncertainty in the world. And you have a whole generation that's very worried about it, and that also creates a lot of disturbance in our social cohesion, which is not a great thing.
Bridge, do you want to pick up there? I'll come to you, Minister.
Maybe I'll answer the other question.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I mean, I don't think we should, take anything for granted. I think that's one of the important, and I was very encouraged to hear the foreign minister's comments and in my discussions with Japanese officials today and in my recent very pleasant, thank you, visit to Tokyo. I think there's just a sort of tectonic shift in the Japanese political understanding, obviously with an understanding of the history that you emphasized rightly, that is focused on defense and collective self-defense and self-reliance for stability. I think we all need to lean in very forcefully into building up our self-defense for the purpose of stability. So I really commend your words, Mr. Minister, and we look forward to working very closely with you and, of course, with our close allies in Australia and New Zealand and elsewhere, obviously the Philippines, to have an Indo-Pacific area, and particularly that first island chain area that is defined by peace and stability, and I think one in which all nations in the Indo-Pacific can chart their own futures. This is a point that the Secretary of War made in his historic speech at Shangri-La last year, pointing out that our approach is really one that's very compatible with the attitude, I think, in the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific idea, with all homage to former Prime Minister Abe, to say, we're not looking to impose our way of life. We're not looking to boss everybody around. We're not looking to become this great empire of the world. We're saying we want to have a favorable balance of power where countries can chart their own future, including, of course, China can continue growing and is a great nation, and we will have respect and mutual trade. It seems to me to be a very reasonable request or ask, and I think countries throughout the region and beyond are recognizing that, so I'm optimistic about that, but I think we all need to deal with, on the military side, with really all due urgency, and that's and effort.
Okay, let me take on a few more questions, maybe together. I see a hand over here. The gentleman, maybe the two gentlemen back to back in row 5, I think. Quick questions, please.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm a professor from China. So indeed, I think that's the value of the MSA to provide a platform to have the different ideas. Because this morning we heard something from Minister Wang of China. And of course, we heard the response from the Japan minister. So I think I just have two questions. One of them for all of the region states, including Japan, New Zealand, and some other. Are we waiting for another kind of ideological war? And we just put China, Russia, Iran, or DPRK together. And then you'll find out another group. So it's still a time for the group confrontation. Secondly, yes, once we realize that there will be some inseparable relations between Europe and Asia Pacific security, if we try to find another way to find out a connection. Anyway, so far, there is not a hot war, just like what happened in Europe for Ukraine for the past 4 years. So how could we find out a way, especially for Asia and Pacific style, to deal with any security risk? So I think there will not be NATO, there will not be another Russia in Asia. So I think that could be the right way for us to think about the future of security in our region. Thank you.
Okay, and that was a question to Minister Motegi, I'm guessing. We'll take one more from the person to your right, George, right?
All right, so this is George from Taiwan, National Taiwan University. So I have a question for Dr. Colby. So first, like today's Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day, and I want to talk about tough love. That's
an excellent opening.
Because I know you're one of the leading voices in terms of trying to push Taiwan to increase its defense budget, and I very much support and admire that. But I want to go back to this term, tough love. So I think Americans sometimes can be very tough, but sometimes not enough love. So when it comes to Taiwan, so I'm wondering, whether it's possible to maybe for the Americans to maybe treat Taiwan with a little bit more love, right? In the context of the politics of defense spending. So let me be a bit more specific. Indo-Pacific. So currently we're trying to pass a new defense spending bill, but it's being stuck. It's not going forward. And frankly, right now, there are, I don't support those positions, but there are people in Taiwan who make the argument that, you know, the U.S. is not very reliable, you know, maybe the U.S., for instance, could be more supportive of Japan, you know, when there was a spat over Taiwan, you know, with China, you know, or maybe the U.S. could adopt more of a strategic clarity type of position when it comes to defending Taiwan. By the way, I have some answers myself, you know, actually to defend the American position, but it's much more effective if the answers come from you. So the question is, yeah.
Thank you for that, George. Bridge, why don't I let you take on that question first, and then Minister Motegi, I'll let you take on the first question after that.
Well, I'm actually going to answer the first gentleman's question first, because I think, sir, from the People's Republic, I think you see that our administration is actually not pursuing a bloc confrontation. So we are very different from John Foster Dulles refusing to shake Zhou Enlai's hand, or even the last administration. The real emphasis on ideology and this bloc confrontation and adversary alignment approach, that's not ours. I mean, we are clear-eyed, we understand, we see what's going on, of course. We're strong and clear but quiet, but we're also respectful, and we're realists. And I had a Chinese counterpart say to me recently, I was explaining our strategy a little bit, or trying to, probably very poorly, but he said, you know, we Chinese, we prefer dealing with realists, and I think we can understand each other, and I think that gives us optimism that we have hope for a mutually productive relationship over time that's also very clear-eyed in both directions, and we obviously are standing with our allies. Sir, I will generalize your question. Obviously, our position on Taiwan remains the same. It's a very sensitive issue in our relations all around, and particularly with the People's Republic. So I won't comment in any way on what's going on in Taiwan. I will merely address the broader concept of tough love, which is to say, I think in a sense, and this gets back, Ravi, to something we were talking about a little bit earlier about, you know, sort of how we're framing and the rhetoric. I think a lot of this is really a matter of degree, and it's all about where you are in the story. And this is why I think the tone is changing now from where it was a year ago, because we do see the progress, and we do see, and the point is not to bang the drum in one extreme direction and say we're never going to do it. But the point is we went from a period, I think, where we were over-assuring far too much and over-indexed, I think, as Richard very justly put it, on the rules and so forth. And I think everything you say makes a ton of sense. We all agree on that point. But now we're in a point where it's more balanced, where things are a bit more conditional. You use the term transactional. But, you know, I like to quote the Charles de Gaulle line about Franco-German, you see Ambassador Ischinger here, you know. It's from, I mean, that de Gaulle said that the Franco-German reconciliation was less a great passion than a cold calculation, and that was suitably Gaullist in its precision. But I think the point is that these things need to make sense. They need to be balanced. We need to recalibrate, but we're always going to adapt. And, you know, tough love is one of the things, but of course the point is there's love in it. There's something that we care about, and we see a lot of results, and we're going to adapt the way we adapt, and with our allies here, we're going to work together in a constructive and results-oriented manner.
Okay, I'm going to take, sure, Minister Van Velde.
Yeah, a very short add-on to the first question, and I fully agree. This is not an ideological approach to a bloc of these countries that you mentioned. However, we do have a brutal war of destruction going on the continent here in Europe. And what we are seeing is that we see Chinese assistance to this war. We see North Korean soldiers in this war. We see Iranian drones in this war being used. So it's not us making the alignment here, but we do see that these countries are choosing individually to support Russia's war of aggression. And that's something that we will react to, not in a bloc, but we will keep talking to these countries individually and ask them to stop supporting this brutal war.
Minister Motegi, did you want to add on to that?
Thank you. Europe?
In Europe, there is NATO, which is a military alliance, but the Indo-Pacific is Asia. A security organization like that do not exist. However, we have Japan-US alliance, not only a bilateral alliance, but also Japan-US, South Korea, Japan-US, Philippines, Japan-US, Australia, and Japan, US, Australia, India. There are many frameworks in this area, including security, but also economic security is another area. Maritime security also included in many areas, including capacity building. We have many initiatives. It is different from NATO, but how we can make a free and open Indo-Pacific with stability. Such approaches are advancing. That is what I think.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one last quick round of questions from the audience. Bonus points if you're able to work in a Valentine's Day greeting. Am I seeing? Okay, row 3, there's a lady who has her hand up, and I see one over there in the corner. Over there, yes. Back to back, quick ones, please.
Hi. Hello, thank you. Latika Burke from the Nightly Australia. Just to follow up on the tough love, does the panel think that there are costs to the first year of that tough love approach?
Okay.
And what are they?
All right, thank you. And a question over there. Yes, please, go ahead.
The title of the panel's, I think, Double Trouble and trying to find the interconnectedness of these two theaters. And I think you could argue that there's no greater geographic manifestation of that than the Arctic. Curious about this panel's perspective on the collusion, to use your words, Undersecretary, between Russia and China around the Northern Sea Route, which is effectively bankrolling the Ukraine war, implicating European interests, but also their collusion militarily in and around the Bering Strait, which implicates U.S. interests and also Indo-Pacific. Thanks.
Any volunteers? So costs to tough love, I guess a non-American would have to take that one. And then Bridge, maybe I'll put you on the hook for that last question. Minister Van Weel, yes.
I'll do the European tough love.
Please.
Maybe one of the Indo-Pacifics can speak to that. I get a lot of questions from reporters today whether or not I'm relieved after the speech of Secretary Rubio.
Were you?
And I said no.
Okay.
But I've also not been that worried after the speech of Vice President Vance last year.
Huh.
And if you look at the messages in both, then they're actually the same.
Exactly.
And that message is that we need to take more care of our own security, and I couldn't agree more, and I think all of my European colleagues couldn't agree more. Now, the reaction that sometimes is put on top of that is that we can't rely on the US anymore. And I think that today's speech was probably easier accessible for people to hear that that's not the case. It wasn't the case in Vice President Vance's speech. It wasn't a goodbye to Europe. It was a wake-up call to Europe. I think we've woken up, great. Whether or not Europeans did that out of anger, disappointment, or motivation, it doesn't matter. But then let this speech help those that were angry to do it out of motivation as well. So tough love sometimes can help, and we do need a more equal relationship also in security.
That perfectly, yeah.
Okay. Deputy Prime Minister?
Yeah, but look, I speak from the point of view of, I guess, Australia's relationship with the United States. I don't think there's a cost. Burden sharing has been a part of the conversation between our two countries for a long time. You know, President Kennedy was talking to Prime Minister Menzies about this in the early 1960s, and and we understand it. And we, you know, in terms of how our relations have gone with the Trump administration since its inauguration, you know, we are really happy with the way in which we've been able to engage with the Trump administration, with how we are working together in terms of jointly giving rise to deterrence in the region. We are dramatically increasing our defence spend. That is what we should be doing, given the strategic circumstances that we face. And you know, and we are actually growing the American footprint on the Australian continent, which again I think is a very positive thing in terms of how we are working together to help promote peace within the Indo-Pacific. So none of it I would put within the language of cost.
Can I?
Sure, very quick last comments here.
Great. So why should the US taxpayer pay for our security if we're not prepared to pay for some ourselves? Huh? It's fair, isn't it? So actually the cost is that we grow up a bit more and we stop just taking other people for granted, and that we have a bit more pride in ourselves and what we can do working together. So actually I find, like my friend Richard does, that we have a very good relationship with the US administration, that we can be very direct because they're very direct, and I love that. They're very direct. And we know where we are, which is we will have to step up. So I think sometimes the cost of that tough love is we grow up a bit more. And I'd say that to Taiwan too. Everyone has to.
You know, we're out of time, but I have to say at this point, I mean, part of the reason why this question keeps coming up is earlier when Bridge and I were speaking one-on-one, I didn't get a clear yes or no answer on Article 5. And the question, the cost, then would be, were the United States to invoke Article 5 again 5 years from now, would other countries follow the call?
Well, we're not part of NATO.
I know New Zealand isn't, but it's
we have in the past. We were in Afghanistan.
Yes.
We were in Iraq.
Would you do it again?
In all these other places.
Would you do it again?
Like with Australia, we've never let them do it. Vietnam.
I mean, Bridge was not going to engage in speculation, and I'm not going to do that either in terms of what may or may not happen in the future. But I think we have been side by side with America in respect of every conflict in which it has fought over the last century. So, I mean, we look to our history in terms of informing how we move forward, and you know, our relation. I very much feel that our alliance with the United States is as significant today as it's ever been. I mean, we are building very much relationships with other middle powers within the region, and that's a critically important thing to do, and I could speak at length about that, and we don't have that time. But to be clear, I mean, there's nothing which replaces American power in the Indo-Pacific, and it is greatly the alliance that we have with the United States is fundamentally important to us.
Okay, very quick final word from Minister Motegi, and then Bridge, I'll let you have the last word.
The ability to respond and to enhance deterrence, is that considered a cost or not? If there's a war, if there's a dispute, a larger cost must be paid. And from that perspective, to deter, the purpose is to deter. That is what I think. And deterrence and response capability, if this is enhanced, it may be possible to resolve problems peacefully. We were discussing about Taiwan.
On the part of Japan, the Taiwan issue, we expect it would be resolved by Taiwan. That's our consistent position. After the war, we have consistently tread the path of a peace-loving nation. And going forward, international peace and stability is something that we'd like to contribute toward. And this morning, China's participant mentioned Japan's security assurance, and that intervention was not based on fact at all. That is what is on my mind. To prevent disputes before it occurs, how to do the burden sharing is something that we have to work out in advance, and I think it's important that we do so.
Thank you very much. I'm going to let you have the last word to close this out.
I'm honored. Last but least, for sure, in this category, honored to be on with this panel. And I think, honestly, I associate myself 100% with everything everybody said, because I think it really, of course, there are costs. There's costs in everything. But there's a lot of discussion of history here. I think if we look over the scope of the last 100 years, both the lead up to the Second World War and then the avoidance of that with no Third World War, the answer is always it's better to have the difficult conversations about, as Japanese Foreign Minister Motegi just said, to have the difficult conversations and make sure that things are fair and square, as Mr. Collins just said, Mr. Marles is Deputy Prime Minister Marles. In a sense, that is the purpose of leadership in our context under President Trump. I mean, here, Secretary General Rutte, all of your leaders, et cetera, is to pay those lesser costs now. And I think we should be grateful. I think I agree with the Secretary General that we're doing that now. So we're in a position, as the Foreign Minister just said, to be operating from a position of peace. So that's, again, why I feel that we can leave this conference. And I think, Mr. Minister, you're exactly right to say Vice President Vance's and Secretary Rubio's, there's a constant theme, and at a lesser level, obviously, my comments, to say there's a trajectory here, but there's also a path. We need to take more responsibility. We want growing allies. We want strong allies. Now it's time to march out, and say and work together in a pragmatic, results-oriented way to come up with alliances that make sense for everybody, that will work. And to your point, Ravi, I mean, I'm certainly not a head of state. I don't think anybody else here is a head of state. It's idle speculation. It's inappropriate speculation. The best thing that people like us can offer is ready forces and societies that have priced in that readiness, that are spending, that have militaries that are ready, that are speaking, you know, softly but clearly, but carrying that big stick. That's the best thing to offer. If I were in the market, that's what I would want. I'd want that a lot more than idle kind of abstractions that are disconnected from reality.
I'm still going to have to ask the questions. Diplomatic panel, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles, Ministers Collins, Motegi, Van Weel and Bridge Colby. Thank you.
Thank you.